Well, hello and welcome, awesome students, and welcome to the week 2 overview. And as you started to see, I kind of help students along by just really giving them a roadmap each week to help them do well in this course and certainly learn the most that they can throughout the program, or give you tips and tricks to kind of help you do well throughout the program. But nonetheless, I'm going to dive into some of the materials this week. And as we get into some of the things, I'm going to give you a little heads up. This is going to be an interesting week where I get to see who's paying attention and who's not paying attention, because if you're paying attention to this video, walking through the process and some of the steps that I'm about to show you, not only are you going to learn a lot, but you're probably going to do a lot better this week, and your life is going to be a little bit easier. And so I really stress that. So pay attention to some of the things that I'm going to talk about in this video as we kind of unwrap or unfold the week, if you will. So talk about a couple of things from this past week. Really, what did we learn this past week? So we started to talk about some therapeutic interventions, and probably the 4 more common or 4 most utilized interventions is what we talked about in week 1, really from the 50,000 foot view, if you will. We looked at some things and kind of said, here's 4 very common therapeutic models and what they're all about. And that's really the gist of what we got into. This week, we're going to take a look at primarily 2 of those. You'll have an opportunity here, and I'll talk about that in a moment, to go much deeper on 2 specific interventions. And we're also going to apply some ethical considerations and things of that nature when we're considering therapeutic interventions. We're going to talk a little bit about readings and research here for a moment, because it is really important that you're utilizing the research and that you're doing the readings each week. And if you pay attention to the note I got below specific to the readings, the language is a little bit firm there, in a sense that if you're the type that's not really into reading and you're skipping readings on a regular basis, then you may have chosen the wrong program, so to speak, and you're looking at going into a master's or a graduate program later on to work in the field. You're going to be expected to do a tremendous amount of reading and reviewing a lot of research. So I strongly encourage you, do the readings this week. They're not too labor intensive, and you're certainly going to get a lot out of it. Learn much about our therapeutic interventions. We're going to dive in just a moment here to the week overview. I'm going to talk you through, if you will, the week as well as the expectations for the submissions this week. And I'm going to give you a roadmap for the basics of research papers. And so I know a lot of students have been doing papers for quite some time. Some students are struggling with it. Some students might have a good handle on that, but pay attention, because I'm going to walk you through a quick overview that'll not only help you frame and structure your paper for this week, but it'll give you a general idea of what expectations are moving forward for those 3-4 page papers, which you probably see quite often. And I'll wrap up with some final thoughts here. So let's take a look at the expectations for the week. We're going to take a look at Module 2, and one of the first things that we're going to address this week in your readings is really taking a look at the APA Code of Ethics. It's really important that you know and understand that the American Psychological Association really has a strong influence on policy, on laws, on things that impact the entire profession. Whether or not you're a psychologist, if you are a psychologist, it's certainly more important. If you're a master's level therapist, you're not really a psychologist per se, you're still going to be mandated by some of the rules of the profession. And so we're going to talk about the general principles here that are kind of guiding what we do as psychologists, and talk about how the APA Code of Ethics really enforces those standards, or really supports quality of care in our profession. We're also going to get into a little bit about evidence-based research, and that's what I'm talking about in terms of developing your research paper for this week. And we're also going to talk a little bit deeper about a couple of therapeutic models, and that's what we're going to get into in the paper this week. And so always take a look at this overview as you start the week. It's going to give you a good insight on what to expect for this week. And as I always coach students to make sure, even if you have a very busy week and you can't get to your homework until Saturday, review this page, take a quick look at the assignments for the week so you understand the expectations, and then take time to get questions answered early in the week so that you're well prepared. So as we look at the readings for this week, I did a little preview and just kind of reviewed some of the readings for this week. And the expectations, I gotta say, are not very intensive here. It's about 20 pages within the text, and there's a couple of articles here. And then most specifically, as I mentioned, you want to pay particular attention to the general principles within the APA Code of Ethics. So I strongly encourage all of you to read through this, maybe read through each one of these paragraphs a couple of times. Again, this is not too much information here, but we're talking about what we strive for as psychologists or as mental health professions, the responsibilities that we have, the integrity within our profession. We don't lie, cheat, steal, and this has to do with a lot of things. We always promote a system of justice and equal rights for all. Now, the Code of Ethics is a lot more extensive. I want to take a moment to just review some of these things down here, but again, pay particular attention to these first 5 general principles, because that's specifically what we're going to talk about as we get into the discussion post this week. So the discussion post this week, we are going to talk about the ethics of using grounded research or validated research in what we're doing in a therapeutic context. So sometimes people think that we just kind of wing it, right? We just go into a room and a client's going to talk to us, and off the top of her head, we're just going to share some insights. Now, it might look like that, or it might seem like that sometimes, but the interventions that we use in a therapy setting are really research driven. In fact, as a student, when you get to a point where you're going to go out on practicums, or if you're in a clinical program where you might go on internships and you do rotations, you're going to spend a lot of time in supervision with someone who has many years of experience, and you're going to very specifically talk about the type of interventions you're going to use, why you're going to use these, and so forth. And so it's really going to be research driven. We're also going to address a little bit in the discussion this week about the ethics and why it's important to do things in this manner to best support the needs of our clients. So make sure that you're active and engaged on the discussion board. You want to have your main post up there. I always encourage students to be at least one day prior to any deadlines, but certainly sooner in the week is always better. We never know what's going to come up, gang. So get your discussion post done, because you want to spend a little more time this week reading, doing some research, and developing that research paper, which we'll talk about right now, in fact. So as you read through this and you read through this information, you're going to think to yourself, we did a little bit of this in week 1, and you're absolutely right. So in week 1, we reviewed some articles that talked about these 4 different modalities. This week, instead of talking and writing a paper covering each one of the 4, you're going to primarily select 2 of them, and you're going to go more in depth on just 2 of them. I'll talk more specifically about what this might look like in your submission, but again, when you're writing this paper, I'm not expecting you to write a page or a page and a half on each one of these therapeutic models, but you might talk about all 4 of them very, very briefly in a couple of sentences. And then specifically, you're going to choose 2 of them to take a little bit deeper, to actually do some research on and provide a little more depth, a little more substance in terms of sharing some information and some insights on these. So here's specifically the questions that you want to address. And anytime you have a submission, gang, make sure you read through the instructions twice, at least, maybe 3 times for some of us, right? I'm probably more in the 3-time category. But make sure you have a thorough understanding of what the expectations are, because as a faculty, we're going to sit back and we know off the top of our head what the expectations are. We're reading your submission. We're looking for key information. If you've covered the information, if it has a good flow and format, it's going to be real simple for us to grade your paper, and you're probably going to do very well. If we have to hunt and search and try to figure out what you were talking about, and it's kind of twisting and turning, doesn't have a good flow, chances are you're not going to do as well. And I also always encourage students and say, you know, gang, the more efficient that a faculty member could work through your paper, it is less likely that, or I should say, it's more likely that they're going to miss or overlook maybe small or minor things. The more time that we've got our eyeballs on your submission, I'm just being honest, more often I'm going to start to see typos and errors in grammar and content and just general mistakes that I may have overlooked if your paper reads very well. So you want to make sure that you have a nice presentation in your submission, because that is going to help you as well in terms of grading. So I've put together a little bit of a overview of how to structure your paper specifically this week, but it's really an overview of how you would want to structure a research paper in general, and give you some idea in terms of expectations about what we want to talk about in terms of what you're going to present in the paper. You've probably all heard this before. As we're writing a paper, we're going to start thinking about or starting with an introduction, and this is essentially telling your reader what you're about to tell them. Identify the information that you're going to talk about. In this case, you're going to be addressing some of the key aspects of the therapeutic models and identifying maybe the two particular therapeutic interventions that you're going to talk about more in depth in your paper. Now you're going to go into the body of the paper, and this is where you're going to share your insights, your wisdom. Now remember, research-driven, research-based information. We're not answering questions off the top of our head. And so in this particular case, a good format that you would want to apply to this is you're going to go more in depth about the first therapeutic intervention that you've chosen. You're going to summarize the key components of that model, talk about if it's traditional, non-traditional, what that might mean for that particular model, something that might be highly utilized for anxiety or depression or what have you in terms of where we would want to apply this model, maybe some ethical considerations for using it, not using it, and then maybe you want to go in depth with some key examples. As I talked about, if you're treating clients with anxiety or depression or schizophrenia, are these appropriate models to use, and provide us with some examples. Again, if you've done your readings, you've done well this past week covering the topic, this should be fairly easy for you. In your second section of the body, you're probably going to want to go more in depth on your second model. I say probably. You do want to go more in depth on the second model you've chosen, really just mirroring what you've done talking about the first model. So say, for example, if you're talking about psychoanalytic theory, and then you're talking about CBT, you're going to cover those similar types of components, so you've got a good overview of cognitive behavioral therapy in one section and psychoanalytic therapy in another section. Make sense? Awesome. The next section of the body that you're going to want to talk about is really where you're going to compare and contrast the two different models. So comparing, we'll talk about the similarities of the two different models. So these are how they're alike. Okay, makes sense? Contrasting would be the opposite, how these two theories might differ. And again, use some specific examples, draw on the information from the research. Again, if you've done your readings, information's right in front of you, and certainly you have the ability to cite your references. When you get into the conclusion, this is the time when you're going to summarize what you've learned, what you found, what you discovered, any insights that you might have. You're going to recap those findings, kind of tie it all together and put a nice little bow on it, so to speak, in terms of writing your paper. And then if there's anything noteworthy that you've discovered along the way. One thing that you want to keep in mind when developing your paper is the introduction talks about what we're going to talk about. The body talks about the information, and as you get into the conclusion, this is not the place to introduce new information, gang. We're not going to slide in something new that you haven't talked about in depth in the body, but their conclusion is a paragraph or so that you're going to just talk about a summary of what you discovered, a summary of what your paper is about. And finally, the last section of your paper should be the references. Make sure that you're putting appropriate in-text citations within the body of your paper, and also make sure that you're putting full APA references at the end. Now, lastly, I really want to stress this as well. It's always best to write in full APA format at this level because that's where the expectations are. That also gives me an opportunity to give you a little feedback and a little bit of coaching if you're off base in that stuff, in that section, if you will, or that criterion, if you will, in terms of APA standards. So in other words, if you put a cover page on there, I can say, great, you're totally on track. If there's no cover page on there, I might put some notes on there, like make sure to include a cover page. But if the cover page is off or your references page is off or something's not in alignment, it's really easy for me to give you some feedback on it. And some students might say, well, I didn't have to do this in my other classes, or, oh, it's only worth a few points. I can assure you, the better that you know how to use this writing style, the better it's going to help you as you progress deeper into the program and certainly in your graduate programs. So with that, I just want to wrap up with a couple of final thoughts. Make sure that you're utilizing quality research. Again, if you take a look at some of my notes below in the email this week, I talk about primary research, secondary research, and tertiary research. For the most part, as we're looking at some of these things this week, you should be utilizing primary and secondary research for everything. Your textbooks are considered tertiary research, but please don't use Wikipedia or go on just general Google and find a blog site that talks about some of these things. Utilize the campus library to find some good quality research, and that will help you out tremendously. If you start out with good research, you can produce a good product. If you start out with junk, you're going to end up with junk at the end. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Shoot me an email. Happy to help. Please don't wait till Sunday afternoon before you ask your questions, because quite honestly, it might be too late because I'm probably not going to get your message until Monday. So I look forward to reading your submissions throughout the week. I'll be completing grading here over the next couple of days. Please review your feedback when I'm complete, and everybody have a great week.